Today is January 6th, where we remember both MAGA's violent insurrection against the United States 4 years ago, as well as the vice president's constitutional obligation to certify the results of the presidential election, even if that particular vice president lost that particular election. Earlier this morning, the current vice president, Kamala Harris, posted a video to social media, publicly reaffirming her commitment to both the peaceful transfer of power and that constitutional obligation to certify Donald Trump's victory over her. And this stands in stark contrast to what we have seen on the record from the incoming vice president, JD Vance, a Republican, who said that had he been vice president on January 6, 2021, he would have unlawfully acted to unlawfully keep Donald Trump in power. The contrast could not be more stark. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we have several clips to talk about in this video. And again, probably most of today's videos, if not all of them, will have a January 6th related theme because it is one of the most important consequential days in the history of the United States, a day when the sitting president of the United States, Donald Trump, fomented an insurrection against the United States to unlawfully keep himself in power. We have never, ever, ever seen anything that egregiously, dangerously corrupt and authoritarian in the history of this country. And for some stupid reason, the American electorate decided to reward that man with a second shot at the title. And yet the contrast in statesmanship between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party could not be more stark. So this is Vice President Kamala Harris in a video earlier today. And I want you to listen to everything she says and note it because we're going to compare it to her successor, to the incoming Vice President, JD Vance.
The peaceful transfer of power is one of the most fundamental principles of American democracy. As much as any other principle, it is what distinguishes our system of government from monarchy or tyranny. Today at the United States Capitol, I will perform my constitutional duty as Vice President of the United States to certify the results of the 2024 election. This duty is a sacred obligation, one I will uphold, guided by love of country, loyalty to our Constitution, and my unwavering faith in the American people. As we have seen, our democracy can be fragile, and it is up to then each one of us to stand up for our most cherished principles and to make sure that in America, our government always remains of the people, by the people, and for the people. May God bless you, and may God bless the United States of America.
Now, MAGA obviously did not respond to this message, which, by the way, avoided taking any sort of direct proverbial shot at Donald Trump and MAGA, even though I think that an explicit political reference to the moral inferiority of Donald Trump was completely warranted. She had every right to do what she didn't do, which is say, and by the way, this stands in stark contrast to the man whose victory I'm certifying, who is too authoritarian, too selfish, too malignantly narcissistic to reciprocate in kind. But she didn't do that. She posted a fairly anodyne but sincere message about commitment to democratic principles even when you lose. Before I get to JD Vance, I also want to play a clip of the former vice president, Donald Trump's former vice president, Mike Pence, a Republican, whose policy preferences are disgusting to say the least, but who, at least when push came to shove, decided not to try to unlawfully keep Donald Trump in power. There's a reason that Mike Pence is not seeking re-election with Donald Trump, the reason that Donald Trump did not tap Mike Pence to be his vice presidential running mate again. And I want you to hear what Mike Pence had to say when Mike Pence was running for president in 2023 about January 6th, when he had to certify the results of the 2020 presidential election. This is what Mike Pence had to say.
And then on that day, President Trump asked me to put him over the Constitution, that I chose the Constitution, and I always will. And I really do believe that anyone who puts themselves over the Constitution should never be president of the United States. And anyone who asks someone else to put themselves over the Constitution should never be president of the United States again.
I wish that were true, Mike Pence. I wish the American people, the American electorate shared your sentiment, but unfortunately we just, as a nation, don't seem to care all that much about constitutional principles, at least when it's Republicans violating them. I imagine sentiment would be a bit more visceral and a bit more sustained had it been a Democrat, right? But fortunately for the Democrats, fortunately for this country, we have at least one morally superior political party when it comes to, honoring constitutional principles. But there you have it. The guy himself, the one who was the target of the pressure campaign, said, my boss, Donald Trump, the sitting president, tried to put himself above the Constitution and tried to get me to help him do it. Therefore, he shouldn't be president. Now, in contrast, you have the vice president-elect, JD Vance, Donald Trump's running mate in 2024. When asked recently, it was during that election cycle, what he would have done had he been Donald Trump's vice president instead of Mike Pence on January 6, 2021, this is what JD Vance had to say.
He was asked to not certify it.
Sure.
So would you have certified? I'll ask you for the third
Again,
time.
I would have asked the states to submit alternative slates of electors and let the country have the debate about what actually matters and what kind of an election that we had.
You
in
wouldn't
these
have
important
certified,
states.
to be clear.
I would have asked the states to submit alternative slates of
I think
electors.
that's what you're saying.
That's what I would have
So-
done. Again, I've said that publicly many times. But
He was asked to not.
So he would not have certified. He would have taken unlawful steps to try to keep Donald Trump in power, despite the fact that Trump lost a free and fair election. The moral inferiority of JD Vance cannot possibly be overstated. The moral cowardice cannot be overstated. He would gleefully sacrifice our democratic republic and our Constitution on the altar of Donald Trump and his own personal ambition. I will remind you, this is what the Constitution has to say about the role of the vice president, who is also president of the Senate, when it comes to certifying the results of the election. The president of the Senate, the vice president, shall, in the presence of the Senate and the House of Representatives, open all the certificates, and the votes shall then be counted. The person having the greatest number of votes shall be president. It's that straightforward. Shall. Not might be, not maybe, not if it is politically convenient for the current incumbent president of the Senate. This is what shall happen. And that's what should have happened on January 6th. And instead, it was the culmination of a scheme by Trump and by MAGA Republicans to steal the 2020 election from President Biden. And what JD Vance is saying, had he been there, he would have done something very different from Mike Pence and not certified President Biden's victory, and instead just given the finger to the Constitution for the sake of Trump and himself. It's disgusting. I also want you to remember, because I've got one more clip to play, some people will lie to you. They'll say, well, listen, there was, this was a kind of a vague constitutional theory, it was just, listen, MAGA and the people around Trump, they were just like, spitballing ideas, throwing, darts out of board just to see if there was a way to legitimately challenge the election. But I want you all to remember one thing. John Eastman, who was the architect of Donald Trump's scheme to pressure Mike Pence into not certifying President Biden's victory, admitted that what he cooked up, his scheme, would involve breaking the law. I'll refer you to what they call the Eastman memos. So when Mike Pence gets to Arizona, Mike Pence announces that he has multiple slates of electors and is so going to defer decision on that until finishing the other states. This would be the first break with the procedure set out in the act being the Electoral Count Act, which is federal law. The first break. We would break the law. This is the first violation of that law, implying there would be more to come, and indeed there would be. We also have emails between Mike Pence's counsel, Greg Jacob, and John Eastman, again, the architect behind this scheme. So this is what he had to say in an email. So now that the precedent has been set that the Electoral Count Act is not quite so sacrosanct as was previously claimed, I implore you to consider one more relatively minor violation and adjourn for 10 days. So that was John Eastman asking Mike Pence, as one of his top advisors, to violate the Electoral Count Act to facilitate Trump's path to power unlawfully. They knew they were breaking the law. As a matter of fact, we learned during the House January 6th Select Committee that Eastman also expected that if this were to be decided by the right-wing supermajority on the Supreme Court, 3 of whom had been appointed by Trump already, so 3 of the 6 appointed by the very man that that Eastman was trying to unlawfully keep in power, Eastman conceded we would probably lose and lose 9-0, that even the Trump appointees would be like, this is so flagrantly unconstitutional and law-breaking that we can't possibly co-sign it. Think about that. And then you might think, okay, so sure, he admits multiple times that this would violate the law, and sure, he admits that had it gone before a right-wing supermajority on the Supreme Court, 3 of whom had been appointed by Trump, that even they would be like, bro, this is insane. We can't possibly do this. You might think John Eastman and MAGA couldn't possibly be more shamelessly unprincipled and hypocritical. Well, look no further than this. Here you're going to hear about a 60-second segment when Mike Pence's top advisor, Greg Jacob, tells the American people that John Eastman also believed that the special authority for the sitting vice president to violate the Constitution to keep a president in power only applies to Republican vice presidents.
Mr. Jacob, did Dr. Eastman say whether he would want other vice presidents such as Al Gore after the 2000 election or Kamala Harris after the 2024 election to have the power to decide the outcome of the election?
So this was one of the many points that we discussed on January 5th. He had come into that meeting trying to persuade us that there was some validity to his theory. I viewed it as my objective to persuade him to acknowledge he was just wrong. And I thought this had to be one of the most powerful arguments. I mean, John, back in 2000, you weren't jumping up and saying Al Gore had this authority to do that. You would not want Kamala Harris to be able to exercise that kind of authority in 2024 when I hope Republicans will win the election, and I know you hope that too, John. And he said, absolutely. Al Gore did not have a basis to do it in 2000. Kamala Harris shouldn't be able to do it in 2024, but I think you should do it today.
So, this is so important because maybe in the millions of people who comprise this country, 340 million, perhaps there are dozens, hundreds, perhaps thousands, maybe tens of thousands who give a shit about principle and consistency. It would be bad enough if there was a genuine principled stance by Republicans that the vice president should be able to effectively, unilaterally toss out the results of an election. That would be bad. That would be unconstitutional. That would be ahistorical. That would be insane. But it would be slightly better if at least they could say, and by the way, we believe that even Democratic vice presidents should be able to do this. We think that Democratic Vice President Al Gore should have been able to do this in 2000. We believe that Democratic Vice President Joe Biden should have been able to do it to Trump on January 6, 2017. We're glad he didn't, but he had the right to do it. And by the way, we're so principled, we believe that in 4 years, Vice President Kamala Harris will also have the authority to do this. That's how principled we are, because we're not hypocrites. But MAGA doesn't take that view. Donald Trump didn't take that view. The architects behind the scheme don't take that view. They were shameless. They're like, no, this is for Republicans. Only Republicans get to do this. The rules are different for Republicans. They're not just wrong. They're not just authoritarian. They are shamelessly, nakedly hypocritical and cowardly. It's disgusting. And quite frankly, in a rational world, if nothing else, even if you took an insane view that the vice president should be able to toss out the results of a free and fair election, a principled person would say, yeah, but Republicans are clearly doing this for naked partisan reasons. They're not consistent. They're not principled. I can't support them. Unfortunately, MAGA compromises their principles again and again and again on the altar of Donald Trump. So we have a lot to talk about today for January 6th, but just remember, where Vice President Kamala Harris and Vice President Mike Pence committed themselves to their constitutional obligations, MAGA Republicans, true MAGA, people like Donald Trump, JD Vance, and others, not only refuse to do so, they gleefully revel. They delight in the asymmetry. They delight that Democrats will observe and obey the Constitution, and they delight in the fact that not only do they not have to, they will be politically rewarded for it with a second term. We're in serious, serious shit here, folks. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.